What's up guys, and welcome to DIY Dudes. In this video, I'm focusing on installing flooring in a basement. And the key here is I want to make my floor as warm and as dry as possible. That's what I want in my house, and that's what I know you would like as well. First, and probably most importantly, is the subfloor. So I've already installed my subfloor, and what I've used is the Barricade Thermal Shield subfloor. So the great thing about this is it is an R4 value. So that means it has a lot of insulation properties. So that's what's going to keep the warmth in your house and prevent the cold concrete floor from permeating through and making your floor cold. It's going to keep your feet nice and warm. The next great thing about this subfloor is that it has a dimple board backing. So what that does is it allows moisture that naturally collects from your concrete slab. It gives that moisture a place to evaporate rather than collect and pond. So any moisture that comes up through your concrete slab is going to dry out rather than collect and grow mold. So that is the key to making your floor warm and dry. The next most important thing is your actual flooring material itself. So I'm using a luxury vinyl plank flooring. So this material is 100% waterproof. It's rated to be used in condos, so that means it's just generally better than some of the bottom of the barrel Home Depot brands you can get out there. Definitely opt for the higher range in the luxury vinyl flooring. This flooring is all tongue and groove connection. And honestly, the cheap flooring has very cheap tongues and grooves, and they crack constantly. The next thing about this flooring is that it actually has the underpad already installed. That's a great combination to use with the type of subfloor I'm using. So you've got the insulated thermal barrier subfloor combined with the underpad on the flooring itself, combined with the luxury vinyl plank flooring, will give you a warm, dry, and relatively soundproof flooring when you combine all those good quality materials. So you're always going to want to start in one corner of your room and work from left to right, just following the tongue and grooves as outlined on your manufacturer's recommendations. I like to install these in a random pattern. So some guys do like 50-50 staggered, and honestly that looks terrible. So what I mean by that is you cut it right in half, and then you start with a half, and then you go a full, and then a half, and then a full, and you want the joints to be staggered and look random throughout your room. So definitely go with the random pattern. The next thing you're going to want to do before you start your install is lay out a couple boxes of flooring. So I've laid out the flooring across my room here. I've got 4 different boxes open now, and I'm basically going to pick through those randomly as I go. So that makes sure that I'm not recycling the same pattern over and over. So again, making sure it's a random pattern. With respect to the tools you need for the install, so you need a flooring pry bar. So this allows me to pull the flooring together as I go. It allows me to pry against it in some of the tight corners. And then you need a rubber mallet. And then a couple scrap pieces of flooring. So I'm going to use these to tap the flooring into place and protect the floor that I lay down with these scrap pieces of wood. I can use the joints, the tongues and grooves, to protect the tongues and groove on the floor and installing. And I'm going to literally lay it down on top and hammer on top of these, so I'm not hammering directly on top of the floor I'm installing. So I'm starting in the corner here. I've got a half piece installed. I'm going to use some scrap pieces of flooring to maintain a 1/4 inch gap along the walls. Your floor is going to shift around quite a bit as you first get started. And this first joint is your most critical and is going to be your most difficult to start, because the way the tongue and groove fits together, just this first joint's really difficult to get installed right without breaking the tongues and grooves. You got to be real careful as you're installing this, because the tongue and groove connections from one piece to the next, you can crack them so easily and you don't necessarily notice right away. You're only going to notice after you've gotten a lot of your flooring installed, and you'll notice by seeing the joint actually separate. So the way you get around that is just you be extra careful with the install. So now I'm going to get my next piece going as quick as I can. I'm not so much worried about where it is against the wall right now. I just want to get these pieces set and locked together without breaking anything. Very good. So I've got my first 3 pieces installed. I'm actually going to cut my other piece now and install 3 boards at a time as I go across this first row across the entire room. I've got my 1 joint here, my next joint is here, my 3rd joint I'm gonna line it up right in the middle of those two. I'm not too particular with the measurements. I just mark that with a scrap piece of tile. As long as I'm cutting somewhere along that point, I know I'm in between these two joints, so I'm not too specific. And what I've done there, I didn't measure anything, I just flipped it. So the piece is actually going to be installed this way, with this end facing out. What I've done is I've butted that one up to the board, and I know that when I cut it here, my good end is going to end up over on that side. So I'll go ahead and cut this on my miter saw. Okay, perfect. So I got my stagger joint set. The joints are all at least 6 to 8 inches apart. You never want these joints too close to each other. This is about a foot apart, so I won't go any closer than 8 inches. I'm gonna install this first run, and then I'm gonna go ahead and square it up to the wall after I get a good distance completed. So for my edge piece, I'm coming up to an angled wall here. So all I've got to do is measure one side of the piece, so the distance of the far corner to the corner of the wall, and then the opposite corner to the other corner of the wall. And then I'm going to transfer those marks onto my piece of flooring, cut it at that angle, and it should just be a perfect fit. So one thing I'm doing as I work my way along the wall here is I've got a piece of the material I'm intending on using for my final trim. I'm actually using this to check my gap to make sure I've got sufficient closeness to the wall. I'm having a bit of trouble in this room in particular because the walls aren't square. It's got a large bow in the middle that kind of comes in and then back out on both ends. So my two ends, I've got a pretty big gap and then not much of a gap at the middle. But what I can do is I can play around with the trim a little bit. If you're in a situation where it's really bad, you can add a piece of quarter round to extend your baseboard out like an inch and a half to end up covering any sort of unsightly gaps you have. But when I install this trim here, I'm pretty good. I'm basically right on. And worst case scenario, with the trim that I'm using, if you absolutely have to, you can't really tell with this piece of wood, but you can put a little shim in the back to set the trim board at an angle so that it covers about another 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. You can angle at the bottom when you have such a big piece of trim. It's really hard to tell that it's installed slightly askew. That's only in situations where you got to cover up a really big gap. If your walls are not square or for whatever reason. It's just a little tip that might help you get through an install. So my last 2 pieces for this row, my starter row, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to measure both sides from each piece. I'm going to cut both of these at once to try and speed things up. And then once I get this in, I'm going to make any fine adjustments and then just go ahead and slam in the rest of the room. Should go pretty quick. The first couple rows are your hardest. That's where you're setting your square. You're making sure everything is nice and straight and the skews are just right and the alignment off the wall is just right. After that, as long as you got the first couple rows installed properly, the rest of the room should just follow suit. 12 1/4 and 19. And then the next one, 30 1/2, 37 1/4. Okay, so I'm back at the start. I'm gonna do 3 full runs. I've got my starter pieces prepped, so I'm gonna continue on with the random pattern. I've got my first joints here that I'm starting against, so I've decided to start with a half piece. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop that guy in. And then I need, after the half piece, I'm gonna go with a full piece. So I need to install one more full piece to get my next row going. And then my next full piece I'm going to start with. So I got my full, and then my next piece up is my 2/3. So these 3 joints are all staggered randomly in a separate pattern that I started my first 3. Now I'm off to the races with installing this next 3 rows. I got a small gap along the seam, and I want to fix that. I'm sure you do too. So you never want to take your pull bar and just start hammering against this tongue and groove edge, because you're going to absolutely destroy it. You need to use a scrap piece of flooring, connect that into the tongue and groove so you get a full 100% connection there, and then use your pull bar to pull against that piece. So you get your rubber mallet, you got your pull bar set properly, you get a slight gap here. I like to hold everything in place and slide the mallet kind of up and down the pull bar. There. 2 little quick taps, and that closed up that joint nicely. You don't need to absolutely beat on this stuff, just gentle. Less is more with this stuff. You never want to hit it too hard and end up breaking it loose. So another neat little trick, when you're measuring these weird angled pieces like that, you'd actually use a piece to send that line down to the wall. One of the most difficult things is you gotta make sure that when you're measuring from this corner, you're holding the tape exactly straight, exactly the same way the piece is gonna go. So that's incredibly difficult to do, and make sure you get it actually right. Doing it this way, I know my line is good. I'm gonna take a little mark on the wall. And then I know that when I go and I measure this piece, I can confidently take my measurement from there to there and know this piece is 12 1/4 on that angle and 5 1/8 on this side. Okay, so I'm halfway through this room, and I've got just enough flooring done to move my big heavy couch from the unfinished side of the room to the finished side of the room so that I can finish the rest of my floor. So guys, in most situations where you're installing flooring in a house that's already been built, you're probably going to have to go ahead and cut the door jambs. Especially in my case, I'm adding quite a bit of floor thickness. This subfloor is like 1 inch thick. and then my flooring's like a 1/4 of an inch thick. So I'm adding an inch and a quarter compared to what was originally here. So what you're gonna need to do is get a scrap piece of your subfloor material and a scrap piece of your flooring material, and use that as a template to make sure that you're cutting the door jamb and the trim around the door at the right height. So I've got my material stacked up here, and I'm gonna go ahead and use my multi-tool with a flush cut blade to quickly cut this trim off and go ahead and cut all the way around through the door jamb and just anything that's gonna be in the way of my flooring, so that I can get that all out of the way. And then when I'm coming through with my flooring, I can tuck it neatly under the existing trim. Now that I've got the other side of the room all cleaned up, everything moved over, it's time to go ahead and finish off the subfloor and proceed with the flooring. If you guys want a full detailed video on how to install the subfloor, check out the other videos on my channel. I have a full tutorial on how to install this Barricade thermal shield subfloor. This is a great product. I definitely recommend you check it out. Okay, so I've got my subfloor all completed. I'm ready to start laying flooring again. I'm going to start with a stagger joint pattern at the far wall, exactly the same as I did in the first half of the room. And before I get going, I've laid out boxes of flooring along the edge of the finished flooring. The reason I did that is I want to add a little bit of extra weight on the flooring I've installed to make sure that all the joints stay nice and tight during construction. As you're installing flooring and coming along and hitting and tapping, there's a chance that these little joints are going to get enough pressure to break. And after you've installed the piece, it's really difficult to notice a piece that you previously installed has actually broken because you're a few pieces away down the road. So this is just one small piece of insurance that keeps your floor from moving too much and keeps those joints pristine up until the point where you're finished the floor. During your flooring install, you're probably going to run into a situation where you got to do some interesting cuts around a door jamb. In addition to my utility knife and my compound miter saw, I quite often end up having to use my table saw. I find using a table saw is the best method for cutting these insane cuts like this. Like, I've got to cut this way, that way, this whole step situation and that over there. There's no way I'd be able to do this with a utility knife, and it'd be very difficult to do with a miter saw. The table saw is going to give you the length of cuts you need to rip these edge strips and do all these intricate cuts around the doorways. I just finished cutting this one, and let's see if it fits. Now in this situation, I'm not going to be able to rock the joint. So what I need to do is use my pull bar to pull the joint into position. And I start in the corner and work my way along the edge and try and close this thing up like a zipper. So this piece up against the wall is a couple of interesting little cuts here. I've got a 90-degree angle, a few different wall corners and different measurements I got to figure out. And instead of taking a bunch of series of measurements and trying to transfer that onto a piece, I want to show you guys a tool that I picked up off Amazon to make templates for each individual situation that you guys come across, quite like this. So this thing is basically a series of rulers connected with little knobs. These knobs tighten, allows you to adjust the lengths and the angles of these different sections to mirror whatever walls or obstacles you guys come up against, to form a template for your situation with which you can use to transfer onto your material and make a perfect cut every time. So I figured out that my 90-degree bend is at 3 1/4 inches, right angle across from this. And I want that to be 2 3/8. My last piece along the wall is gonna have to be a custom cut. Whatever you can do, you wanna try and avoid having a thin strip at the end. And really the only way to do that is to check your room, the width, and then divide that by the number of planks, and then cut your starter piece to suit accordingly, depending. In my situation, I didn't have to do that. I started with a full piece on that side, and I'm gonna end up with a big chunk on this side. Your situation might be a little bit different, but again, just measure the width of your room, divide that by the width of the planks, and as long as you come out with something a little more than half a piece, you should be in pretty good shape. Perfect. Lines up perfectly with my trim. It's a beautiful piece. What's up, guys? If you've made it to the end of the video, I really hope you learned something and your flooring turned out as good as mine did. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.